Okay, so let's talk about HTML. So HTML, as you might know, it stands for Hypertext Markup Language. So basically, it allows us to very quickly format what would otherwise be just plain text and tell a browser how we want to lay out a page, right? On how and tell them that we want some headings, some paragraphs, some lists, some tables, and there's specific types of elements that allow you to format and give some behavior to some of this content. The top level set of elements describe this to be an HTML document. We have the opening HTML, closing HTML, and we have the top two levels elements, head and body. The head is used to describe some very top level description of a document, such as the title, any dependencies that this particular document has with other documents, right? So that's some metadata about the document, and then body displays the actual content that we want to display for user consumption. Here's just some really simple elements that we're going to be using all throughout. We have the headings that allow you to have different sizes of text for introducing a particular section of an HTML document. The bigger the number, H1, H2, H6, it's smaller headings. We have paragraphs that add vertical spacing between content. Typically, if you have just plain text, browsers ignore any white spaces. So if you add any number of new lines in your document, those are ignored by the browser. If you want to explicitly tell the browser that you want breaks between your content, you need to explicitly use paragraphs or headings which add vertical spacing between the content. Okay? So these paragraphs, these P, opening P and closing P, says that this is a paragraph and that they should be separated with vertical spacing. Lists allow us to describe content that is related, that are part of a particular multiple options as part of the same list. You have unnumbered, unordered lists and ordered lists, 1, 2, 3, 4. You can also choose A or Roman numerals, different styling for the bullets. But these are the default styling for lists, and you have OL and UL for ordered and unordered lists. Tables. Tables allow you to lay out tabular data, right? Data that typically would be represented as records, right? That might have the same types of fields, that have the same data types. So, for instance, you might have multiple users, one user per row, and they all have the same type of columns of the same type of data. Right? Some of the columns might be dates, some of the columns might be emails, some of the dates might be currency, but typically we want the same columns having the same type of data. That's the intended use for tables. You can declare the first row to be a heading row, whereas all the other ones might be data rows, right? And to do that, we have tables being able to describe two different sections of a table head, table body, and each one can have rows. In the table head, we can have multiple rows. Here we just have one row, and notice that we have TH for declaring that we want to declare headings at the top of each one of these headings over here, and they're going to be styled a little darker and centered to just highlight that these are headings at the top of a table. Below that, in the body of the table, we can also use table rows, but we can use TDs so we can render these as actual data as opposed to headings. So here we have actual content as Alice, passwords and whatnot, first names, last names, and roles. Okay. So here's a couple of other elements. We have input fields that allow us to enter some really short textual data, such as first name, last name, emails, and whatnot. We can uniquely identify these inputs, such as, for instance, saying that this is a username field. IDs allow you to declare unique identifiers in a page, right, so that they can be referenced with some logic, perhaps, or by JavaScript, right, to be able to grab them by ID and operate on individual input fields. The browser won't validate that IDs are unique, but it is your responsibility to make sure that IDs are indeed unique, right, within a particular page. Notice that one of the behaviors that IDs allow you to have is that you can declare labels. See those labels at the top, right? Those labels have a for element attribute there. See that for? For is referencing the username field down below. See that? So that adds some really interesting behavior, right? Typically, when to add focus on a particular field, you have to click on the field. Yes, either with your mouse, or if it's on a phone, you need to tap with it with your finger, right, to focus on a particular field because you're going to input data in there. Yes, right. What labels allow you to do and allow you to associate labels with a particular input field, right. What that introduces is the behavior that if you click on the label, right, the input field now receives the focus, right. What that does is that it increases the clickable area, right? It makes it so much easier, at least in small screens, that you don't have to peck at the input field, but you can create a bigger clickable area, touchable area, so you can click anywhere near in the label, and you can create the focus on that input field. That's a best practice that you should implement in all user interfaces, right? To increase the clickable area, make it easier for folks to interact with your user interface. So that's definitely a requirement in all your forms, in the assignments. In particular, this particular assignment, where you're creating several forms. Also, another best practice here, you'll notice that input has 3 attributes. Right? You have input has the ID attribute, the type attribute, and the placeholder attribute. See that? Right? So it's a best practice to have each attribute in separate lines of code. In separate lines. This makes it easier to read for your fellow developers, right, that are looking at your looking at your source code. And it's easier to read an attribute per line as opposed to a long line of attributes. Makes it harder to read, right? So it makes it easier for your fellow developers. What else? Notice that the attributes are nicely lined up, again, to improve readability for other developers. Also notice the placeholder there. See the placeholder? And notice that it provides a grayed out sample of what type of information are we asking you, right? Maybe some sample data that you would expect us to type in there, like a username. Maybe we would use some common username, maybe John or something. In your particular culture, you would use a particular name that might be useful in your particular area. And so Alice is grayed out, and so that's a placeholder. That's also a good practice, right? To give as much hint at the user as what type of information are you asking me, right? Perhaps it would be a bad practice to put in the placeholder username, right? Because that would be redundant, right? The label already says username, and saying username again in the placeholder would be redundant and just is not adding any more hint, any more information. But for instance, if it's a phone number, you might provide there a sample phone number, maybe the format that you want it at, or if it's a date, also you would provide maybe a sample of the date format that you're asking for, whether it's European or your particular geographic area. So that would be a hint for the users to use. Something that is not shown here is an additional help would be to provide a title here. A title So what a title does, it creates a like a tooltip, right? So that when you hover over the input field, it pops up a tooltip, right? That might provide some help on what it is that we're expecting there, right? Maybe it's a salary, or maybe we're expecting some information, and we could have a paragraph, explaining what it is that we want. So it would pop up as a tooltip. So title would allow you to add a tooltip. Everybody okay? All right, so these are things that we would expect. Also notice that things are nice and lined up. So that's also expected for user interfaces. Dates. Dates can be implemented by using the type equal date. Right? So if you do that, it'll use the default widget for your particular browser. Each browser will have a different widget. Right? And some folks don't like that. That it'll render differently on Safari and render differently on Netscape or differently on Firefox. They all have different. Unfortunately, it's not standard. But the cool thing is that on mobile phones, it'll use the correct keyboard for your particular iOS or Android device. Some developers they'll do is that they won't use the type equal date. Instead, they'll use a widget implemented by jQuery. We'll look at that next week, implemented with a JavaScript widget instead. Notice the label also referring to the input field. For dropdowns, we can use the select elements and giving it a name. Notice the name of the field. Notice that all these inputs have a name. Right? The input here does not have a name. So it's usually a good practice to add a name to the input field. In this case, we're naming the select a role, and then the different options that we went to that are going to be in the dropdown. Each one of the options is implemented with the option element, and notice that it's wrapping around the text faculty, student, and admin is being wrapped by the option elements. Yes. So that's the data. That's the text that is being rendered in the dropdown. So this is the text that appears in the dropdown, and it's the default value of the selected option. Whichever you select. Ideally, you would also provide a value attribute, which would be some token that would be friendly to the server where this data is going to go to. Right? Maybe this will be a token that some server was going to parse and make some logic. Right? If it's an admin or faculty or student, we'll set some role, some user on the server. Right? So you can have user-friendly text. This can be user-friendly text, could be verbose, with parentheses and explanations and whatnot. But the actual value that is submitted to the server is whatever value the option has. Make sense? So there's a distinction on if you don't provide the value, then the actual value will be the text, right? The human readable text. Buttons. So buttons allow you to invoke actions, such as delete, edit, submit. Submit, if you create a form, submit will actually submit the form to the server. Right? That's the default behavior of a form and a submit button. Okay, we're not going to use that default behavior. Instead, we're going to use JavaScript to do that. All right, so we're not going to use submit. Instead, we're just going to use the plain old buttons and use JavaScript instead, right? To look at the form, right? Validate the form, create an object, and then send it over to the server, right? Instead of using the default submit behavior. So no submit, only just plain old buttons. Checkboxes. Checkboxes are also implemented using the input field, the input element, and but with different types. The type can be either radio to create radio buttons, and checkboxes, right, to implement checkboxes. So checkboxes are meant to have a toggle behavior, whether it's selected or not, whereas radio buttons are meant to be mutually exclusive, right, where you provide certain options and you select one of them, and they're mutually exclusive. If you select one, it turns off all the other ones. Whereas checkboxes allow you to have multiple checkboxes selected, and are not mutually exclusive. Now, even though now usually you want to create many groups of checkboxes or groups of radio buttons that are somehow related to one another, right? So, for instance, in a checkbox, you might want, select all applicable, all your favorite genre, for instance, right? And you can select many genres, right? Horror, comedy, documentary, right? All your favorite genre. So you can have many genres, and so all of them are describing the genre, yes. Whereas down below you might have, give me your favorite movies. That's a separate selection, yes. Genres are all together, and movies are all together, but they don't mix, yes. So to be able to create groups of checkboxes, you create them by using the same name, right? So you could have name equals genre, right, with multiple checkboxes using the same name, creating all checkboxes are related to one another, and then maybe another set of checkboxes with movies, a list of movies, and they're not mutually exclusive. But when you submit it to the server, all the movies and all the genres will be collected as comma separated values that are all together. Here are all the genres, comma separated, and here are all the movies, comma separated. All right. Checkboxes behave differently. You can also create groups, right? You can say, are you tenured? Yes, no. Right? And the way you know that these two are mutually exclusive is that they have the same name. They have the same name, and that's how they know that they're mutually exclusive, right? That they can't be both true, right? If I select one, it unselects the other. Right? So A and A here are mutually exclusive. If I select one, it unselects the other. But I can have multiple questions. Are you a tenure? Are you a smoker? Right? Are you whatever? Right? A whole bunch of mutually exclusive yes and no's. Right? And the way they know about each other mutually exclusive is that they would have the same name. Okay? So for instance, one of the names might be tenured, and the other names might be smoker. Yes? And then they would know to be mutually exclusive between each other. Otherwise, they would not know. If you have just radio buttons with no names, they would not know that they're related to one another, and you could select all the checkboxes, and they would not know to turn off all the other ones. Make sense? Also notice that these checkboxes are wrapped with a label. See that? Right? What that allows you to do is to make the text tenured, okay, or yes and no also clickable, so that if you click on the text, it toggles a checkbox, so that it knows that and again, that's a good practice, a best practice, to increase the clickable area or the touchable area as big as possible, especially on small screens where you're pecking at these checkboxes or you're pecking at these radio buttons. You want to make it as easy to click on as possible. Make sense? Again, a best practice. Anchors. Anchors allow us to navigate from one page to the next. Right? Allows us to refer to another document and make a piece of text clickable. Right? Where you click on a text and then it replaces the current HTML document. It replaces it with some other document, right, that is referred to in the href attribute here. Right? So it throws away the current document, and it goes and fetches this other document, and then it renders that other document. Okay? This is the classical way of navigating from one page to the next, and it has been the most common way of doing it for decades. Today, we have kind of abandoned this way of navigating between pages. Instead, today we use a single page application model, where we load one first page, okay, and then we give you the illusion of navigating by instead replacing the content of the page with some other dynamic content, right? Many applications do that. Do this today. Facebook does it, Twitter does it, Gmail does it. As you click through hyperlinks, the page is not dumped. Instead, it fetches other content and it replaces the main content dynamically. Right? So we'll look at that a little later. But still, we use anchors, but not href. We still use anchors, but not href. Well, not this way anyway. We use anchors. We'll see how to do those a little later. All right, so let's create something. Let's create a user admin table. I only have 5 minutes.